Hello and welcome to this presentation from the Urban Penguin. My name is Andrew Mallett, and in today's presentation we're going to go through and look at creating a virtual machine in VMware Fusion and then using Packer so we can create a Vagrant box to be uploaded to the Vagrant website. Come on, let's go through and see this step by step. In our first step, we're going to build an image in VMware Fusion for Rocky Linux 8.1.0. So, of course, to begin, we have to be able to create our golden image. And I'm going to do that in VMware Fusion, but just make sure you've got the latest version. It has to be the Pro version if you're going to use it with Packer. So let's go through and just pick up my ISO file. We're going to run through the installation really quickly because the concentration here is not so much of installing Rocky Linux 8, but it's a matter of making sure that we know how to image it with Packer. So I'm setting a reasonable name for my VM, so I'm calling it Rocky_Linux_8.1.0. We'll need to be able to make reference to this later on. I'm going to go into my settings and I'm going to use 2 processors. That's going to be okay, but we're only installing a server version, so I don't really need 2 gig of RAM, so I can go through and set that. And then I can fire up my virtual machine, choose to run the install. Once it boots, I can set the locale, so I'm going to keep it on US. And of course, we've got our normal configuration to make. I'm going to go through and set the time and date. And for the region, I'm just going to set this to ETC. And then from ETC, I can scroll through and then I should be able to see coordinated times. Yeah, coordinated universal time. And we can continue with that set. Next up, I can go through and choose the software install. I can choose server, but I'm going to choose minimal install. And then I'm just going to put the standard tools. And then we can click done on that. For the installation destination, we just need to go in and click done if we're going to take the default. For the network, I can turn the network on. And we can move down to the host name if we so wish. And we can set the host name and domain. I'm going to leave the domain to local domain, and I'm just going to put then Rocky 8 in there. And then we can continue. We can set our root password. I'm keeping this all to Vagrant. I'm going to be sharing this through the Vagrant site later. So we want to make sure that people do have access to this system. And we can go through and create our Vagrant user. So again, this should be Vagrant as a username and Vagrant as a password. And making sure that we tick the make this user an administrator. We can begin the installation and of course allow the installation to run through, and then once it has, we can reboot the system, and this is where we can then make our customization. So with the system rebooted, I can log in as my Vagrant user and the password of Vagrant, and I need to make some customization. I'm going to install the Git client so I can access a Git repository with a script that we can execute to configure the system. So I can go through and just do a sudo and yum install. And as I say, we'll put it on our Git client so that we're able to clone a repository. So let's go through and add this. One of the things we want to fix is this problem of having to put a password in for sudo, but we'll also be installing some additional utilities. But I can now go through and clone github.com, the Urban Penguin, and we can go through and just have VM And from here, I've got a script called setup Rocky. So I can go through and run from the VM directory setup Rocky. And I say this will then go and do a lot of the hard work. It will make sure that the public key is shared for the Vagrant user. So we're able to log in using key-based authentication. We've got the VMware tools installed and started and a few other utilities. But we can now power off our machine and we are done and dusted in creating our image. For step 2, you do need to make sure that you have the HashiCorp products installed, Packer and Vagrant. There are different ways that you can install HashiCorp products, but the best way, I think, is to go to releases.hashicorp.com. So here we can see all of the products that HashiCorp have available. So it's just a matter of navigating down to the correct product that you want. I have both Packer and Vagrant installed, so I won't be running through the install. But if I move down to Packer, we can look at the latest version, and we can see then that we have different versions for different operating systems. And we can see that we have Mac, FreeBSD, Linux, NetBSD, OpenBSD, Solaris, and Windows. And these are single executables that you can add into your system. So there's no real installation, it's just adding in the single executable. Moving back to the main list, I can navigate towards the bottom and look for Vagrant. And when we look for Vagrant, you can see here that we've got a DMG file, this case for OS X, and we have MSI files for Windows. So it's a matter of choosing the correct file for your operating system and making sure that that's installed. But do make sure you have both Packer and Vagrant up and running for the next step. Our third step is to create the Packer HCL file and create our Vagrant box. Now I'm back out working at the command line of my Mac OS system, and I'm in my home directory, and I'm going to go back and clone the repository that we looked at earlier. Remember, we cloned it on our Rocky Linux system, the virtual machine, earlier. We now need a configuration file to help us with Packer. So we can go back out to github.com, the Urban Penguin, and VM, and we can allow that to come down. And if I move into the directory, so CD and VM, I can run a listing, and we'll see, well, at the moment, I've just got 2 files in this repository. The setup script that we saw earlier that we ran on our virtual machine, but what we're going to concentrate on now is the .hcl, the Packer HCL file. This describes how we're going to build our Vagrant image. Now, we can see it from the command line, but it's going to be easier to read if I look at it in my IDE. So I'm going to open it up in PyCharm. PyCharm understands the HCL files, and the first block that we're looking at is the Packer block. This then specifies that we require 2 plugins, or think of them as drivers. Our source is going to be VMware, so we need a VMware driver. And our destination is Vagrant, so we need the Vagrant driver. So the first block really is just specifying the drivers that we need to work with our project. Within the middle, our middle block, if you like, is our source block. We're setting up a source, we're calling it VMware VMX and VMware, and then our source path. Now make sure this is pointing through to your VMX file. On OS X systems, or Mac OS as I'm using, you can see that it's virtual machines.localized, and then the name of the virtual machine .vmware VM, and then the VMX file inside of that. The communicator, we're going to be communicating to the VM with SSH and using Vagrant and a password of Vagrant. We shut the machine down when we're finished, and then finally we look at the build. We can see the build area now quite clearly. The first area is our sources, referencing our source block we looked at previously. With a provisioner, we can run a shell script, or we can run even things like Ansible playbooks. But we don't need to do anything in provisioning our image, putting extra elements in. So our post processor then references our Vagrant driver that we installed earlier, and we can go through and see that we can keep our artifacts, which we don't need, and then our output is going through to the Rocky 810 VMware.box, just a local file. So that's moving back now to our command line. And the first thing we can go through and do is just check you've got Packer up and running. So running something like Packer version is going to show you, well, obviously the version, but it's proving Packer is working on your system. Now you see there is a later version available, but I'm happy with the version that I've got, so I'm going to stick with it. And then we can run Packer init. Now this then, we can specify the name of the HCL file. So this is going to download any drivers. Now I already have those drivers on my system, so the VMware driver and the Vagrant driver. But if you're doing this for the first time, you should see those drivers being downloaded. We can then go through and run our validate to make sure that the file reads okay. And that's all looking very good. Make sure, of course, that you are setting the correct source for your virtual machines, and then we can go through and build based on the HCL file. So you can see then the output all colored green, so this is good. If it starts going red, then we have some problems. So we're waiting obviously for the system to boot, and I can drag it across and you can see that it is firing it up, and it just calls it a clone. So we can then go in. We don't need to do anything with our virtual machine. But then there was nothing to provision inside of it, so it didn't need to add anything. And it's now shut the system down. We can see that it's waiting for VMware to clean up after itself. And this can take a few minutes, so give it a couple of minutes or so. I don't particularly need the box open anymore, so I can close the VMware box, but then it will tidy itself up, and then we're looking to compact our virtual disks and creating the box file. And we can see then that it is now complete, and we have created our first Vagrant box. We can list the directory and we can see there that we do have the .box file, so it has successfully created. So now I can go through and add it to my local Vagrant. We will add it to the Vagrant site later, but for the moment, let's just go through and test that it is working properly. So Vagrant box add. I'm just going to call it test/Rocky. And then I can go through and tab complete on the name of the box file. And we can see there that is then adding the box, reading it locally, adding it to our local repository for Vagrant. So the green letters indicating then that we've created our box in the repository. So now let's go through and test it. Remember, we always want to test it before making it available to the public. We can create our Vagrant file with Vagrant in it. I always put the --minimal, and then we have to reference our image. So test and Rocky is what we just called it. So that's created my Vagrant file. I can go through and I'm going to edit it. I was going to look at it, but I do need to make some changes. So let's go through and edit the Vagrant file. Now this would work, but it's going to give me some warnings. We want to make sure that it keeps the PCI slot the same as it's being used for the network card. And we can go through and just add in an extra configuration block. So config VM .provider. And of course, we're using the VMware Desktop provider. VMware Desktop will work both for Fusion and VMware Workstation. And we can go into the Ruby loop for this. This is really written in Ruby code. So we can call our block VMware. So it will now be VMware dot allow list underscore verified, and set this to true, and make sure we end the block. And that's it. It would work anyway, but we'd just get warnings. So this is going to prevent the warnings. And when we're ready to go, we can run our Vagrant up. So this will then clone the virtual machine, creating a local copy to be fired up as your virtual machine. This is what I love about Vagrant, is it's so easy to create and destroy virtual machines. So brilliant for testing, brilliant for administrators, brilliant for developers, brilliant obviously for DevOps. But with this then coming up, again, this is good. We're not getting any errors. And we can now go through and run our Vagrant SSH. This is where we're using key-based authentication. And we're into our system. We can check the operating system. So it is good. It's Rocky Linux 8.10. We can check our host guest file system by listing the Vagrant directory. And we can see our host file system. And we can see then that we've configured time date CTL with the UTC time zone. We can exit out, and then once we're finished, we can destroy the virtual machine. So it deletes the cloned copy, but obviously our initial Vagrant machine is still going to be there. But that's it. You've created a Vagrant box now. Having created your box file, you now want to upload it to Vagrant so it becomes publicly available. Now I've jumped out to my browser and you can see that it's pointing to app.vagrantup.com, and we can look at then uploading this to the Vagrant cloud. Of course you don't need to, but if you want to make it public available, then you can. Now you can see I already have an image uploaded for the Rocky 810 server, but at the moment it's only for VirtualBox, so we can add in a new provider. Obviously, if you were creating a new virtual machine image, you'd choose the option for a new image. On the provider, I can go through and choose VMware Desktop, and I say that works then for VMware Fusion or VMware Workstation. The next thing is the checksum. So this is to make sure then that the file has downloaded correctly by comparing the checksum. So we need to calculate one from the command line. So I can move back out to my host system. And if I just clear the screen, and if I get a SHA-1 hash, I can use SHA-SUM. And then on the Rocky file, so Rocky 8, there you go. Take a little while as it checks it, but there you can see I've got the SHA-1 hash. So obviously we can put the hash on the server. When I upload, it will check then the hash is correct. And when clients download, they'll be able to check their download matches. So we can go through and put SHA-1 as the type, paste in the hash, and then we can continue to upload. This is going to give us a choose file button. So I can then go out and choose the box file we just created. And we can allow the update to go through. I've cut out the upload because, again, it's probably going to take 20 minutes or so, depending on your network. But then as I go through, we can see now that I have VirtualBox and VMware Desktop. So we're looking good to go. If it was a completely new image you had uploaded or a new version you're adding, you have to make that the released version. But if I'm just adding a provider, the version's already released, so I don't need to do anything. So then going back out to my command line and editing the Vagrant file to run a test, I can then change from my test Rocky and then just paste in the Urban Penguin Rocky 810 server. We're still using the provider VMware, so that's going to be good. And now when I do my Vagrant up, of course, we've got to download it the first time. I've just cut out a little bit of the download to save you watching the box. But you can see now that we've downloaded it and we're comparing the checksums. They must have been successful, so we can continue. We're now cloning the machine and starting the machine up. We're waiting for it to boot. As it then boots, I can go through and run my Vagrant SSH. And yes, we're in on Rocky 8. We can run the hostname CTL. That's going to show us then that we are now running VMware and Rocky Linux 8.10. So this is good. You've seen how we can build our image in VMware, how we can use Packer to create a Vagrant box and then upload that Vagrant box to the Vagrant Up website.
All that is left to say is thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this, then you are probably sadder than I first thought. For more of this drivel, please subscribe, like and comment to @TheUrbanPenguin.